Oliver Stone once said, "I don't think it's right in our filmmaking culture for filmmakers to trash other filmmakers. We take so much from press, especially if you're established, that it's mean-spirited." Real noble idea, in theory. But in reality, plenty of directors have no problem going after each other. I was actually a bit surprised at just how many of them have done it. Like, I know Tarantino's constantly out there talking trash about something. But the hate for Spielberg? The stuff said about Scorsese? Didn't see that coming. Some of this stuff goes way beyond professional criticism. Anyway, here are some of the harshest, most unfiltered shots directors have fired at each other. Michael Bay has been Hollywood's favorite punching bag for years. Film snobs love tearing him apart. Too many explosions, too much nonsense, too much toy selling. Not totally unfair. Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, Transformers, not exactly high art. But when you're one of the highest grossing directors of all time, probably doesn't keep him up at night. One guy who definitely doesn't have any love for Bay is Uwe Boll. If you don't know him, he's the guy behind a bunch of disastrous video game adaptations nobody asked for, and possibly the only director in history to settle his feuds by boxing his critics. Back in 2008, Boll challenged Bay to an actual fight. Pay-per-view, Las Vegas, the whole thing. Said Bay was wasting his massive budgets and sucks big time. This wasn't just some random rant. Boll was dead serious. Called himself the only genius in the whole fucking movie business. Trashed Bay, threw Eli Roth in there for good measure, and went way beyond what was acceptable even back then. If Bay had any sense, he would have ignored it. But no, he actually responded. Called Boll a sad being, said he was just screaming because he's not being heard, and dropped the classic, "Do I care? Not in the slightest." Which, let's be honest, if you're responding, you definitely care. Tarantino divides people like few directors can. Some see him as the last real Hollywood auteur, the guy keeping that rebellious old-school filmmaking spirit alive. Others are not so impressed. Harmony Korine falls into that second group. Best known for Spring Breakers, Korine got compared to Tarantino early on. Someone even wrote, "We don't need another boy wonder at Cannes." Korine sure didn't love it. In an interview with Roger Ebert, he basically shut it down, pointing out that Tarantino was 15 years older than him and from a completely different filmmaking generation. "I'm not a video brat," Korine said. "I don't derive all my inspiration through movies. I get it from a lot of other places too." And yeah, that was definitely a dig at Tarantino, who famously borrows from other movies. Korine didn't stop there. He said Tarantino gets too caught up in other films, mashing them together like some kind of pop culture blender. He admitted they can be fun in the moment, but for him, there's a void. Feels empty. Feels flat. And he made sure to draw a line between being inspired by films and just copying them. Nick Broomfield's got no problem saying exactly what's on his mind. The guy's been making solid documentaries for years, covering everyone from Sarah Palin to Kurt Cobain, so he's earned the right to speak freely. And when it comes to Tarantino, he did not hold back. Asked about his most hated movie, Broomfield went straight for Kill Bill. Called it a schoolboy's fantasy of violence and sex, the kind of thing Tarantino would have been wanking to alone in his bedroom while his mother made his baked beans downstairs. But this time Harvey Weinstein's behind him, and it's on at 1 million screens. Yeah, that's a real quote. Broomfield didn't stop there. Said Tarantino seemed confused in his mixing of sex and violence, like a kid let loose in a candy store. Ended with a brutal closer. Kill Bill should never have left the lab. Harsh? Absolutely. But if there's one thing about Broomfield, it's that he does not care if he makes enemies. And look, Kill Bill is excessive. That's kind of the point. The special effects team used over 450 gallons of fake blood between both movies. That's why people love it. European filmmakers could be just as catty as Hollywood ones, maybe even worse. Francois Truffaut and Michelangelo Antonioni weren't exactly fans of each other's work, and they didn't bother hiding it. Antonioni's the kind of director you either love or completely tune out. Truffaut was very much in the second camp. He said, "Antonioni is the only important director I have nothing good to say about. He bores me. He's so solemn and humorless. Antonioni didn't take that one lying down. He fired back with something a little more poetic, but still very much a diss. I think Truffaut's films are like a river, lovely to see, to bathe in, extraordinarily refreshing and pleasant. Then the water flows and is gone. Very little of the pleasant feeling remains, because I soon feel dirty again and need another bath. That one came from his Playboy interview in 1969, where he kept going, basically saying Truffaut's films leave him cold. Thought René Clair told light stories better. Thought Truffaut never really hit him in the gut the way Godard did. Truffaut doesn't always get the credit he deserves, but the 400 Blows is untouchable. Scorsese even put it on his list of 39 must-watch foreign films for aspiring directors. Love him or not, the guy made an impact. Truffaut wasn't the only one throwing shade at Antonioni. Turns out, Ingmar Bergman, who could be surprisingly sharp-tongued, wasn't a fan either. Antonioni's slow-burn style and detached characters didn't work for everyone, and Bergman wasn't shy about saying so. In 2002, he admitted that Blow Up and La Noche were masterpieces, but everything else was boring. Never understood why Antonioni was held in such high regard. Fellini, Kurosawa, and Buñuel move in the same field as Tarkovsky. Antonioni was on his way, but expired, suffocated by his own tediousness. Bergman didn't hold back. But here's the thing, some of the same directors he name-dropped actually loved Antonioni. Kurosawa thought Antonioni was one of the most interesting filmmakers out there. Tarkovsky was directly influenced by him, especially when making Nostalgia. Stanley Kubrick put La Noche on his list of top 10 favorite films in 1963. Even Jean-Luc Godard called Antonioni the director who influenced modern cinema the most, and in the US, Coppola and De Palma both paid tribute to him in their own films. So, for every director who found Antonioni's work suffocating, there was another who thought he changed cinema. Ingmar Bergman's movies aren't exactly light viewing. Heavy on psychology, existential dread, and the whole "what does it mean to be human" thing. People call him one of the all-time greats, and yeah, he definitely saw himself that way too. Which is why things got a little tense when he went up against another all-time great, Orson Welles. Welles is basically cinema royalty. Citizen Kane has been worshipped by critics since 1941, always at the top of every greatest movies ever list. But Bergman didn't buy into it at all. He thought the whole thing was overhyped. The production, the performances, the storytelling, none of it impressed him. I think it's a total bore. Above all, the performances are worthless. The amount of respect that movies got is absolutely unbelievable. Welles wasn't exactly the turn-the-other-cheek type. He had already trashed Bergman years before, saying, "There's an awful lot of Bergman and Antonioni that I'd rather be dead than sit through. I share neither Bergman's interests nor his obsessions. He's far more foreign to me than the Japanese." Back in the day, European directors used to hate Jean-Luc Godard, and to be fair, he kinda asked for it. Godard didn't just tolerate being personally disliked, he leaned into it. But love him or not, his films shaped modernist cinema as it exploded in the 60s. Without him, a whole era of filmmaking looks completely different. As a person, though, he was not an easy guy to get along with. Went after other directors constantly. Wrote such nasty letters to Francois Truffaut after Day for Night that Truffaut never spoke to him again. Straight up made Agnes Varda cry. So yeah, not shocking that Ingmar Bergman had zero patience for him. I've never gotten anything out of his movies. They have felt constructed, faux, intellectual, and completely dead. Cinematographically uninteresting and infinitely boring. Godard is a fucking bore. He's made his films for the critics. Orson Welles and Ingmar Bergman pretty much hated each other, so them actually agreeing on something, that's rare. Turns out they both thought Jean-Luc Godard was overrated. By the 50s, French New Wave was in full swing, ditching the Hollywood studio system, shooting on the streets, capturing real life as it was. And Godard was at the center of it. Breathless pulled straight from Orson Welles' playbook, using jump cuts to make sure you noticed the filmmaking. But Welles himself didn't care for it. Godard admired his style, but that didn't go both ways. His gifts as a director are enormous. I just can't take him very seriously as a thinker. Herzog always came across as pretty open-minded when it came to movies. Praised The Dark Knight, had good things to say about wrestling, just generally seemed like a guy who could find value in all kinds of entertainment, which is why his complete distaste for Godard is a little surprising. He called Godard an intellectual counterfeit, a criticism that's been thrown at him more than once. And when Herzog doubles down, he really doubles down. Compared to a good kung fu film, someone like Jean-Luc Godard is intellectual counterfeit money. To be fair, these two were on completely different planets when it came to filmmaking. Herzog was all about physicality, feeling the world under his feet. Godard lived in the abstract, pure symbolism, pure theory. His movies aren't easy to appreciate, and Herzog had zero patience for that kind of thing. Godard couldn't have cared less about Hollywood. The Academy tried giving him an honorary Oscar in the 90s, and he straight up ignored it. Didn't show up, didn't acknowledge it, nothing. If the Academy likes to do it, let them do it. But I think it's strange. I asked myself, which of my films have they seen? Do they actually know my films? So yeah, not exactly shocking that he had zero interest in Hollywood's golden boy Tarantino. But this one actually stings a little because Tarantino was a massive Godard fan. He even named his production company after one of Godard's films. And here's Godard's reaction. I think his work is null. He chose the title of one of my worst films to name his production company. That doesn't surprise me at all. Tarantino, of course, knew Godard's work inside and out. Working at that video store gave him access to thousands of movies, and he studied Godard. He once called him the Bob Dylan of cinema. To me, Godard did to movies what Bob Dylan did to music. They both revolutionized their forms. But eventually, he outgrew it. You get into him for a while, and he's like your hero for a little bit. You start drawing shit like him, and then you outgrow. I think that's what Godard is, at least for me anyway, as a filmmaker. Fandom turned disillusionment. Happens to the best of them. This one's been floating around forever, but even now, it's still kind of baffling. And with Lynch's passing, it'd be nice to hear Tarantino acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, this one was a bit much. It all went down in the 90s, when Tarantino went off on Fire Walk with Me. Twin Peaks is easily one of Lynch's biggest achievements, but Tarantino had zero love for the 1992 prequel. He said, Lynch had disappeared so far up his own ass that I have no desire to see another Lynch movie until I hear something different. Lynch, on the other hand, never backed down. He loved the film, even when nobody else did. Said he learned the hard way from Dune, lost control, watched it bomb, and felt like he died twice. But with Fire Walk with Me, at least this time, the failure was his own. Spike Lee versus Tarantino is one of the nastiest Hollywood feuds ever. Back in the 90s, these two were actually huge fans of each other. Tarantino was raving about one of Lee's earliest films as a big deal for African-American cinema, and Lee was hyping Tarantino as this really exciting new voice on TV. But then all that goodwill went flying out the window around 1997, right when Jackie Brown dropped. Lee had a major problem with how often the N-word got tossed around. Apparently, it's in there nearly 40 times. He basically said Tarantino was a little too obsessed with using it. Like, what does he want to be, an honorary black man? Tarantino shot back, saying he didn't need Lee's blessing, and basically accused Lee of acting like he was in charge of deciding which white directors could tackle black themes. Spike attacked me to keep his Jesse Jackson of cinema status, he said. Basically, you needed Spike's blessing if you were white and dealing with black stories. I wasn't asking for it, and he hated that. Tyler Perry is one of the most commercially successful names in American entertainment. His Medea movies are consistent box office hits, pulling in anywhere from $50 to $100 million a pop. A lot of people see him as a major force in black entertainment, but Spike Lee has never been a fan. Makes sense. Perry's movies are straight-up entertainment, loud, broad, and crowd-pleasing. Lee is about serious, socially conscious filmmaking, not exactly a match. Lee accused Perry of leaning into racist stereotypes just to sell tickets. Each artist should be allowed to pursue their artistic endeavors, but I still think there is a lot of stuff out today that is coonery buffoonery. Perry's heard it all before. He fired back, calling the criticism elitist. Said he's not inventing these characters. He's writing what he grew up with. There's a certain part of our society, especially black people in the culture, that they look down on certain things within the culture. For me, I love the movies that I've done because they are the people that I grew up with that I represent. Spike Lee went after a lot of big names, and Clint Eastwood was one of them. Lee took shots at Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, saying both movies ran over 4 hours and didn't have a single black actor. Eastwood didn't hold back. Said the real flag raisers weren't black, so putting a black actor in just to satisfy critics wouldn't be historically accurate, and a guy like Lee should just shut his face. This wasn't the first time Lee had gone after Eastwood. Back when Bird came out, Lee questioned why a white director was making a Charlie Parker biopic. Eastwood's response was simple. I was the only guy who made it, that's why. He could have gone ahead and made it. Instead, he was making something else. Then there's Changeling. Lee didn't call him out for that one, but Eastwood still took the opportunity to make his stance clear. The movie's set in the 1930s Los Angeles, before the city's demographics changed, and Eastwood stuck to that. Said he wasn't making some equal opportunity commercial. He was making it the way he saw it historically. Jacques Rivette never hit the mainstream like Godard or Truffaut, but he was making noise. His films were experimental, uncompromising, and deeply political, on screen and off. In 1966, he pissed off the French Catholic Church with The Nun and got it banned. 2 years later, he and his film revolution buddies had literally shut down the Cannes Film Festival in protest. So, yeah, Rivette had no problem making enemies. And of course, a few very famous American names landed on his absolutely not list. No surprise there. European directors love to drag Hollywood, but even by those standards, Rivette went in hard, especially after Kubrick. A Clockwork Orange is a film that I hate. Not for cinematic reasons, but for moral ones. Kubrick is a machine, a mutant, a Martian. He has no human feeling whatsoever. Apparently, Kubrick wasn't enough, because Rivette also went after Titanic, the movie that made $3.6 billion and has been breaking people's hearts for decades. Rivette called it straight-up garbage. Actual garbage. I agree completely with what Jean-Luc said. It's garbage. Cameron isn't evil. He's not an asshole like Spielberg. He wants to be the new DeMille. Unfortunately, he can't direct his way out of a paper bag. Just in case that wasn't scathing enough, he also trashed Kate Winslet, called her unwatchable, said the movie only worked because it appealed to slightly plump American girls who saw themselves in her and kept going back like it was a pilgrimage. Some directors just don't like Spielberg. Alex Cox is one of them. English filmmaker, writer, actor. You know, the guy behind Repo Man and Sid and Nancy. Cox had success early on, but when it comes to Spielberg, he's not exactly a fan. And look, Spielberg's career speaks for itself. Jaws, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, the Indiana Jones trilogy, the guy's made some of the biggest and most beloved movies of all time. Cox doesn't buy into the magic. His take is simple. Spielberg isn't a filmmaker, he's a confectioner. Not the first time Spielberg's taken heat. Even Truffaut had some choice words after working with him on Close Encounters. Thought Spielberg was indecisive, insecure, and wasting studio money. To be fair, Spielberg was still new then, but as of 2025, he's still the top-grossing director worldwide. Whatever Cox thinks, Spielberg's probably sleeping just fine. Tarantino loves Westerns. John Ford, though, not so much. One of my American Western heroes is not John Ford, obviously. To say the least, I hate him. That's Tarantino, straight from an interview with Henry Louis Gates. And he's not just talking about the way Ford filmed Native Americans like faceless targets in the background. He sees Ford as one of the guys who kept pushing that whole Anglo-Saxon humanity above everyone else's narrative in Hollywood for decades. And then there's The Birth of a Nation. Ford showed up as an extra in that mess, playing a Klan member, not exactly helping his case. If there's one thing Orson Welles loved, it was a good takedown. The guy had opinions, and he wasn't afraid to voice them. Hollywood, European filmmakers, actors, no one was safe. And yeah, he had some thoughts on Fellini too. His films are a small-town boy's dream of the big city, Welles told Playboy in 1967. He shows dangerous signs of being a superlative artist with little to say. Not exactly a compliment. But Fellini was an absolute class act about it. He's right, he said, and that's no insult. If Welles had issues with Fellini, his feelings on Woody Allen were pure loathing. Not just professional dislike, he hated the guy physically. Didn't even want to be in the same room with him. Welles couldn't stand Allen's whole neurotic shtick. Said he had the Chaplin disease, this mix of arrogance and self-loathing that made his skin crawl. Henry Jaglom tried to defend Allen, saying he was just shy. That went over terribly. Welles immediately launched into one of his most scathing rants ever, called Allen's whole persona fake, said that shy, quiet routine was just a cover for massive ego. He hates himself, and he loves himself, Welles said. It's the most embarrassing thing in the world. Welles had zero love for Hitchcock, called him senile, said he'd fall asleep mid-conversation, and had nothing nice to say about most of his movies. Welles straight up trashed Vertigo and Rear Window, said everything about them was stupid. Thought Hitchcock got lazy, stopped caring about how his movies looked. The only one he ever liked was Shadow of a Doubt. I've never understood the cult of Hitchcock, particularly the late American movies. I don't recognize the same director, egotism and laziness, and they're all lit like television shows. With Kazan, it was personal. The two had similar starts, both stage directors who made their way into Hollywood. But Kazan's name will always be tied to one thing: the day he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, naming names and selling out colleagues to save his own career. Back in the 1950s, this was the committee that dragged people in, accused them of being communists, and wrecked their lives if they didn't cooperate. Hollywood eventually forgave Kazan, even gave him a Lifetime Achievement Oscar in 1999. Welles never did. He hated Kazan for ratting people out, said he couldn't forgive him, called it one of the worst betrayals from someone who was supposed to be on his side. He was one of the biggest sellers of people up the river in the whole bunch. I am not a vengeful person, but Kazan is one of the people that I feel really badly about. Back in the day, Kevin Smith had some serious beef with Magnolia. He wasn't alone. When Paul Thomas Anderson offered George C. Scott a role, the man literally threw the script across the room and said, "This is the worst fucking thing I've ever read." Smith, for his part, took a different approach. He kept a copy of the film on his desk, not to watch, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too self-important. Years later, someone reminded him about this, and he backpedaled hard. Basically admitted he was just salty that Anderson's film was getting attention while his wasn't. He even called his past self a jealous little bitch. Now that's some serious growth. Since we're on the subject of Kevin Smith, his movies are not for everyone. Kind of like Tyler Perry's if you squint, except way less commercially successful. And one of his loudest critics was David Gordon Green. Pineapple Express, Halloween 2018, Halloween Kills. That guy. Back in 2001, Green went after Smith hard, basically saying his movies lowered the bar for filmmaking. He kind of created a Special Olympics for film. They just kind of lowered the standard. I'm sure their parents are proud. It's just nothing I care to buy a ticket for. And sure, everyone's entitled to an opinion, but coming from the guy who gave us Halloween Kills? Bit of a reach. If you don't know Vincent Gallo, he's the guy behind Buffalo 66. Directed it, wrote it, starred in it, even did the music. The guy did everything, and somehow, it worked. A weird, brilliant little movie. Gallo's got opinions, though. A lot of opinions. And when it comes to Spike Jonze, he did not hold back. According to Gallo, Spike Jonze is a complete fraud. Boring in real life, zero personality, not funny, not smart, nothing. And yeah, he actually called him a pig piece of shit. But here's the ironic part. Gallo never even said this in a real interview. This all came out in 2010 when a journalist leaked a secretly recorded conversation they had back in 2003. Naturally, Gallo freaked out and sued him. Before he made Buffalo 66, Gallo was making waves in the New York underground scene. Street performances, indie films, the whole deal. He got his first major role through that, Eric Mitchell's The Way It Is, and from there, he went all in. Wrote and starred in his own films, released music on Warp Records, raced Grand Prix motorcycles, even sold his sperm as conceptual art. So yeah, that guy has thoughts on Scorsese. I wouldn't work for Martin Scorsese for $10 million. He hasn't made a good film in 25 years. I would never work with an egomaniac has-been. Bad Lieutenant is Ferrara's biggest movie. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars. Scorsese called it one of the best films of the 90s. So when Werner Herzog decided to do his own take on it, Ferrara was furious. I hope these guys all die in hell. I hope they're on the same streetcar and it blows up. The irony, Herzog's Bad Lieutenant Port of Call New Orleans wasn't even a remake. No Harvey Keitel, no connection to the original story. Just Nick Cage playing a completely different character and a title slapped on for marketing. David Cronenberg doesn't hate Hollywood, but you wouldn't know that from some of the things he said. The French press was so convinced he did, they literally ran an interview with him under the headline, "I don't hate Hollywood." Apparently, they thought he'd spent decades seething over the industry, but Cronenberg was quick to shut that down. He actually has a lot of affection for Hollywood's past. That being said, the man has no problem trash-talking when he feels like it, like that time he went after Kubrick. Cronenberg called The Shining overrated, said Kubrick didn't even understand horror, and straight up claimed the guy was more commercial than artistic, more concerned with what would sell than with making something truly personal. The French love Peter Greenaway. They call him Britain's most aristocratic auteur. Meanwhile, in the UK, he's an embarrassment, at least according to Alan Parker. The French have been obsessed with Greenaway since The Draughtsman's Contract came out, mostly because he's the opposite of what British cinema was pumping out at the time. Alan Parker, though, wasn't impressed. Called The Draughtsman's Contract a load of posturing poo-poo. And considering this is the guy who gave us Evita and Bugsy Malone, that's a little ironic. Alan Parker wasn't Greenaway's only hater. Ken Russell wasn't exactly sending him Christmas cards either. Russell once said that Greenaway's films make his flesh crawl. I think it's his apparent loathing of the human race. He is more interested in shit than soul. To be fair, this was in the 90s, when Russell's career was circling the drain and Greenaway was pulling funding from places that had long since stopped returning Russell's calls.